He runs Seoul's most dangerous criminal empire from the shadows, untouchable, unmerciful, and completely alone by design. She's been hunting him for 3 years, armed with nothing but the truth and the kind of courage that makes dangerous men nervous. When Evelyn Smith, a razor-sharp investigative journalist from New York, witnesses something she was never meant to see, Kang Min-jun makes one cold, calculated decision: take her. Not to hurt her, to silence her, just long enough to protect everything he's built. Except nobody silences Evelyn Smith. She challenges him when every instinct says surrender. She sees through him when 15 years of carefully constructed walls are impossible. And somewhere between captivity and chaos, between gunfire and stolen midnights, the most feared man in Seoul starts feeling something he buried the night he chose power over everything else. Now rival families are closing in. Betrayal is bleeding from his inner circle. And Kang Min-jun, who has never once chosen a person over his empire, is about to make the most dangerous decision of his life. In a world built on blood and loyalty, she might be the only thing worth fighting for. Hit that like button and drop a comment. Now let's begin. Evelyn woke to silence, so expensive it had a texture. No chains, no blindfold, just 1,000 thread count sheets, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking a Seoul skyline that looked like something from a dream she hadn't earned, and the slow, nauseating realization that this was very, very bad. He was already in the room when she sat up, standing near the window with the particular stillness of a man who had never once been startled by anything. Dark suit, hands clasped behind his back. Eyes that gave away absolutely nothing. "You'll stay here until I decide otherwise." He said it the way other men said good morning. Calm, final, almost courteous. "I want my camera back." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close enough to be infuriating. Evelyn didn't waste energy arguing. Instead, she did what she always did, she observed. 2 exits. 1 guard she could hear, not see. Window locks, electronic. She catalogued every detail with the quiet efficiency of someone who had reported from war zones and survived worse odds than this. Across the room, Kang Min-jun watched her do it, and said nothing, because he was, despite everything, faintly impressed. He came to her the next morning with coffee and a proposition, in that order. The coffee was perfect, which felt deliberate. The proposition was clean, surgical, and delivered without a single flicker of pressure. Her silence, in exchange for a story so devastating, so meticulously documented, that it would redefine her entire career. Names, dates, wire transfers, a corruption network that reached places her 3-year investigation hadn't even imagined. Evelyn listened to every word. Then she said no. Something shifted behind his eyes, not anger, not frustration. Something that looked uncomfortably close to respect, which annoyed her far more than anger would have. Later, she heard the other one, Park Seo-jin, sharp-faced and watchful, speaking to Min-jun in low, urgent Korean, just beyond the hallway door. She didn't need a translator for the tension. She is a liability. End this. Min-jun's response was quiet, measured, and final. She stayed. Neither of them acknowledged it directly. They simply moved through the rest of the day in a careful, loaded orbit. 2 people pretending the air between them wasn't shifting, pretending the ground wasn't already giving way beneath the careful positions they'd each decided to hold. Neither of them was winning. Neither of them had noticed yet. She found him at 2 a.m., which was not supposed to happen. Evelyn had been chasing sleep for hours when thirst finally pulled her toward the kitchen. And there he was, sitting at the marble island in the blue dark quiet, a book open in his hands. Dog-eared, worn at the spine. The kind of worn that only comes from being carried everywhere and read more than once. Poetry. She recognized the format before she could read the words. He didn't close it, didn't explain it, simply watched her fill a glass of water with those unreadable eyes and waited to see what she would do with what she'd seen. She sat down across from him. For a moment neither of them spoke, and then somehow, in the particular honesty that only lives at 2 a.m., they began to talk. About New York winters, about what it costs to care about the truth in a world that keeps punishing you for it. She told him about her mother, A woman who marched into every room like she owned the air inside it, who taught Evelyn that silence was never neutral. Min-jun listened the way people do when they're filing something away somewhere sacred. He said nothing about his own mother, but he didn't leave. And later, alone in the dark, neither of them would stop replaying it. The news came in at 10:30, a quiet word in Min-jun's ear, a barely perceptible stillness that moved through the room like a current. Evelyn watched it happen from across the penthouse and understood immediately that something had broken in the world outside these walls. He didn't rage, didn't pace. He simply stood at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, that familiar posture, except this time his jaw was tight and his knuckles were a shade too deliberate. Small things, the kind of things you only noticed if you'd spent days studying a person against your will. She crossed the room without fully deciding to. The Shin faction. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. "They're not after your operation," Evelyn said quietly, her journalist's mind already mapping the geometry of it. "They're after your confidence. This is a message hit. They want your people nervous before the real move comes." The silence stretched. Then Min-jun turned and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, unguarded, just for a fraction of a second. He hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected her. And that, she realized, was the most dangerous thing yet. The dress was red. She suspected that was intentional. Evelyn negotiated her terms before agreeing. Her notebook returned. One phone call to her editor, no touching without her permission. Min-jun accepted each condition with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to contracts written in far higher stakes than this. They arrived together. They performed beautifully. She laughed at the right moments. He kept his hand at the small of her back with a restraint that somehow felt more intimate than anything careless would have. The room watched them with the particular hunger of people who traffic in weakness, looking for cracks and finding none. Then Chairman Yu, old money, older cruelty, leaned across the table and said something about her in Korean, low and smiling, clearly intended to land. It landed. Min-jun's response came without hesitation, quiet, precise, and carrying the specific weight of a man reminding another man exactly how fragile his position was. No raised voice, no visible anger, just words that made Chairman Yu's smile die completely and left the entire table recalibrated. Evelyn understood enough to know what had happened. Something warm moved through her chest, unbidden and unwelcome. They didn't speak about it. Not that night. Not for 2 days after. She found it by accident, the way the best stories always broke. A pattern hiding in plain sight, patient enough to wait for someone paying the right kind of attention. 3 days of watching. Communication timing that didn't align. A response that came 12 minutes too late, from someone who was supposedly in the building. Small fractures, invisible unless you spend a career learning how lies breathe inside the truth. Evelyn sat with it for an hour before she made her decision. She could walk this information out of the penthouse, leverage it into her freedom, her camera, her story. Every rational instinct she owned pointed toward that door. She found Min-jun in his office instead. She laid it out methodically, the pattern, the timing, the name she'd arrived at. He listened without interrupting, which she'd learned meant he was taking it seriously. When she finished, silence filled the room like something physical. "Why are you telling me this?" His voice was careful, quiet. She opened her mouth and closed it. The honest answer was that she didn't entirely know. He reached across the desk then, slowly, deliberately, and touched her hand. Barely, just his fingers over hers for several suspended seconds. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The line between them held, trembling. The confirmation came by midnight. The fallout was handled the way Min-jun handled everything, swiftly, quietly, and without visible emotion. By the time it was over, the penthouse felt hollowed out, like a place where something had been removed and the air hadn't adjusted yet. Evelyn found him on the rooftop an hour later. She didn't ask what happened, didn't offer condolences or careful words or the journalistic instinct to fill silence with questions. She simply walked to the railing beside him and stayed, her breath clouding in the cold Seoul night, the city burning gold and indifferent 30 floors below. He spoke eventually, slowly, like a man excavating something buried under years of deliberate concrete. His father, A choice made on a winter night, not unlike this one. The empire kept, his mother left to face the consequences alone. The lesson a 12-year-old boy absorbed without anyone meaning to teach it. Love is the thing they use against you. The man he swore he'd never become. The man he built himself into anyway, brick by careful brick, because it turned out survival and transformation could look identical from the outside. Evelyn said nothing. She just listened, fully, completely, without moving to fix a single word of it. It was the most seen he had ever been. He fell, quietly and entirely, and told her none of it. They came at 3 a.m, which meant it had been planned by someone who understood that exhaustion is its own weapon. The ambush was precise and catastrophic, the kind of coordinated violence that announces itself, not with warning but with consequence. Evelyn was cornered within minutes. 2 exits collapsed, the sound of gunfire rewriting the geometry of every route out. Min-jun came through the 3rd exit. Not his men first. Him. Moving through the chaos with a single-mindedness that she would later learn had terrified even his most seasoned lieutenants. Like watching a man decide that every calculation he'd ever made no longer applied. He reached her. He was already bleeding. She got him out anyway, half carrying him through the dark with his blood warming her hands and her heart, doing something loud and irreversible in her chest. The safe house was 40 minutes away and felt like 40 years. Afterwards, in the small hours, in a room that smelled like cold concrete and something almost like safety, she pressed a cloth to his wound and found she was shaking. He caught her hand, held it still. Evelyn, just her name, but the way he said it contained everything neither of them had allowed themselves yet. She looked up, met his eyes, and finally, stopped pretending she didn't know exactly what this was. The story ran on a Tuesday. Evelyn's editor called it the most important piece of investigative journalism the publication had seen in a decade. 14 officials were named. 3 arrests within the week. A city that had learned to accept certain darkness suddenly blinked in unfamiliar light, deciding slowly that it preferred this. She had edited it carefully, surgically, deliberately, protecting the names that deserve protection, drawing the line between truth that liberates and truth that simply destroys. It was the hardest version of the story to tell. It was also the most honest. Min-jun read every word without comment. Then he looked at her with something open and unguarded in his expression that she suspected very few people had ever been given access to. The Shin faction was finished. His own house, slowly, painfully, being rebuilt on different terms. He was not a changed man overnight. That was never the story. He was a man taking deliberate steps toward something that had light in it, which for Kang Min-jun was its own quiet revolution. They were not a fairy tale. They were complicated and thoroughly improbable. He chose her anyway. Every logical argument considered, weighed and set aside. It was the only fight he'd ever been grateful to lose.